Chapter 29. Night. The lady had spent her day in loneliness. As soon as she realized the magnitude of her husband's ambition and the consequences that must come of it, she couldn't so much as speak to the Coyote. Talk simply wasn't in her, and she dreaded to face Chanticleer, and everything else in existence diminished. 10,000 animals were nothing. She wanted only to be alone. "I'm sorry," the Coyote had said. She couldn't thank him. She couldn't ask how much he loved his wife, Rachel. Love had become such a cruel thing to her. She left. Altogether dazed, she wandered the Liverbrook south through the woods, and south until it met with Wormsmere, the sea now frozen to its bowels, humped and yellowed and silent. "The cold goes deep, my lord." Then she walked westward on the plains. She brushed the stones with the tip of a wing. Her face was numb. Her heart was numb. "The cold goes deep, my lord." In time she came to the old earthwork, the wall her husband once had engineered against the enemy, when hope and a certain warmth had bound them all together. There, on a whited ruin, she sat down, and she sat merely. For the rest of the morning she held her peace. But at noon, under a grey sky, while picking at her feathers, she suddenly threw up her head and wailed, "He wants to fight Worm? What then? Oh, Lord! Oh, please, my lord, the cold goes deep, my lord, my lord!" And she burst into tears. She was angry with Chanticleer. It seemed that she hated him for his childishness and his everlasting obsessions. She wept until her throat ached, and the tears went dry, and the sobs came in separate spasms, and this was several hours. In the afternoon she wrapped her wings around herself. All alone and softly she sang, "Made love to me so slow and sweetly, sighing names he came discreetly home. And I to him gave children after, I it was had cried through laughter, 'Come.'" She closed her eyes. What would she do with all her memories? Ponder them? But then, in the darkness, the beautiful Pertelote heard the distant vespers of Lord Chanticleer. That trumpet shuddered her as well as any other, its longest note literally taking her breath away. It must have reached to the end of the earth. And he, she understood, was persuaded of his holy enterprise. He was bounden to it. He was crowing creed. So she said, "We've had our tears. Enough. She lifted her head. She stood up with slow resolution. "It's his decision," she declared out loud, "his honor, his purpose, his dignity. So, I will not trouble him with my troubles. So, I will accept him now as I did at the beginning. Chanticleer is Chanticleer." The hen walked to the site where the coop had stood before the war. She measured the ground from one corner and found a hollow covered by woven branches and sealed in ice. With a sudden strength she smashed the ice, and then she picked the weave apart by jerks of her claw. When she had torn a hole in the earth pocket, she drove her beak into it, and withdrew 2 utensils of leather and metal. Yet for all her resolution, Pertelote could not help despising the taste of that leather. This one night, Chanticleer did not seek solitude down the Liverbrook. He sought Pertelote. This should not be a night alone. He wanted her body next to his, and forgiveness if she could give it, and the assurance that when he left tomorrow there was peace between them. But he didn't know where to look for her. The wood and the world were huge after all. The sky was starless. He stood still, a doubtful rooster on the ice. She had ever been a woman unto herself, quiet, private, and never truly claimed by the land. By the marriage, yes, and by motherhood when that was a reality. By friendship, but not by the land. She could have gone anywhere. Perlote, born and raised in another place, a woman already when he met her. Perlote carried memories in her that he would never know. She had never made much of her past except that it had been difficult and that it was over. Yet because a part of her was secret from everyone, the lady always seemed something of a sojourner in Chanticleer's land. Not his. She was not his hen, but wholly her own. Then she could be anywhere. He shouldn't have neglected her during the day. He shouldn't have taken her for granted. He stood on Liverbrook ice, a perfect fool, paralyzed by his ignorance. He had no idea where to look for her, and the world was huge, and the night was empty without her. "Perlote?" Then a little sound touched him on the back of his brain. It was so tiny that he didn't hear it. He suspected it. He screwed his eyes to the darkness. "Hello?" Tink. There, downstream the Liverbrook, there, and not ice only. The ice had grown so old it lost its crystalline quality. It sounded lumpish and wooden these days. Tink. That was not ice. Tink, tink. Chanticleer went to his toes and stretched his neck. He cocked his head to stare with one eye and then the other. The sound was regular and ringing, delicate, metal on metal. "Perlote? Perlote? Is that you?" Who else would come with such a delicacy? No one. Chanticleer allowed himself to grin. He didn't deny a flush of joy, and he began to run toward the noise. And here came a darkened figure, walking slowly the bends of the stream. Beautiful, sure-footed, sure-spirited, Perlote indeed. 2 straps hung from her beak, 2 metal pieces at the ends of these, striking one another as she walked. Tink, tink. "Oh, Perlote!" Chanticleer cried, overcome by the woman's goodness, her simply being there. He choked. She said, "I thought you'd want these. I polished them for you." "Perlote," whispered the poor cock. "Sit," she said. "Sit down, sir, and let me have your ankle." He sat. He loved her. He loved her touch, but he could only shake his head. With efficient skill, she bound a terrible spur to Chanticleer's lower shank, a gleaming, reaching weapon named gaff. By this weapon he had killed the cockatrice. She drew the leather tight with her beak. To his other leg she tied another, this one named the slasher, no less fearsome than the first, and a yank made it tight, and then she herself sat down silently. She was done. When he could find his voice, the rooster said, "Then you approve?" Perlote's own voice was not missing. Nevertheless, she waited before she spoke. And then she said, "I ask only that you do not do this thing in madness, that you are not mad, Chanticleer." "Touch me," he said. "Do I feel like a child or an idiot?" She didn't touch him. She said, "It's not the cockatrice. Worm this time. You're going to fight Worm himself. Do you know what you are doing?" "Yes," he said. "That he is the evil one." "Yes," he said. "And what the consequences of such a fight must be." "Yes," he said. "Perhaps I'll set Mundocani free." "Perhaps," she said. She closed her eyes. "But that's not what I mean." "No," he said. "That's not what you mean." "Say it," she said. "Say it aloud." And he said, "I will die." She said, "Yes." She said, "Thank you." And then her whole body shuddered, but her eyes stayed closed, and she did not cry. "You will die, Chanticleer." Neither touched the other for a while, because what were they, now that the truth was spoken? Husband and wife? Widow, corpse, and comforter? What were they doing here? Remembering? Cherishing? Taking leave? Chanticleer was the cause of this. Therefore Perlote had to speak first, because he didn't have the right. When she did, it was in a diminished voice. Tell me the worth, Chanticleer, she said. Tell me the need. And he was conscious of the depth of her question. For both of them, the rooster chose his words with scrupulous care. For righteousness, he said, and as for me, for penance. He thought through his answer. So often Chanticleer had acted in passion, afterwards justifying the act. This one time, for this extremist venture, it was necessary that he explain himself first and clearly. My life has been a shameful thing, Pertolote, he said. I've been a sickness in the land, and who's to say that all our sorrows don't find their source in me? It is wrong, wrong that Mundocani moans in hell. It is wrong for him, wrong for the earth, wrong in the order of things, and it is my wrong. And what can I do about it? He stopped. He wanted to speak few words, not many. He did not want to protest, only to explain. Unless I die, he said slowly, then all this life is a death. Do you understand that? But if I sacrifice myself, then this life was something after all. I need to plead forgiveness. I need to do one thing right, and the best thing of all. Otherwise, he said, how could the animals live in peace? Otherwise, he whispered, how could you love me? Pertolote fairly wailed in her anguish. But I do love you. I am someone now, he said. No, she cried. I loved you all along, no matter what you thought you were. Don't scorn me so much as to think I've been blind. I knew you, and I still loved you. When I ignored you? When you ignored me, of course. You were here, weren't you? Pertolote, he said sharply, stopping her. This is me. This is me. This is Chanticleer, finally. This is the way I should be. I've taken an oath. I've challenged Worm in a sacred vow to fight him. By the grace of God, I now have the chance to find him and fulfill the oath. To be! In dying, I will be. This is me. This is my being now. This is my purpose, my justification, my goodness. My goodness. To fight and to die. Ah! Gasped Pertolote as though she were falling, and Chanticleer rushed to her. He caught her in his wings, wrapped her all around, and hugged her tightly from the ice, from the night, from tomorrow, from the terrors of this sinful world, from fear. He had a boldness in his heart now, and by that boldness he wished his wife a perfect peace. Oh God, it was so good to be holding her again. And when she allowed it, when finally she shaped her body to his own, he nearly wept for gladness. He was her husband, protector again. He squeezed her till he trembled. And in this wave of loving her, he whispered, sacrifice. Almost divinely, he murmured, sacrifice. It isn't madness, is it? She didn't answer him, and still she didn't cry. He rocked his beautiful Pertolote and whispered a litany of names. Lord Russell the Fox, he said, him, the wee widow mouse, Nimbus and Beryl, that humble hen, the rat Ebenezer, whom I do not forget, and the thousands, the meek and the faithful thousands, and the turkeys, he chuckled to himself. Our children, too, the pins, the first, the second, and the third, they, none of these, shall have died in vain when I have met their murderer. Is that madness? She shook her head. I hear how you name them, Chanticleer, she said. I hear how deeply you care for them. But you always did. But this thing, this obsession... She stopped. Slowly Pertolote returned his hug. She felt the warmth coming to him as a gift. He felt her cheek upon his neck, caressing him, and now the tears did run from his eyes, for she had chosen. He had not demanded. You are my husband, she whispered. I am your wife. I love you, Chanticleer. That is not madness. Almighty God, the rooster cried, watch over this woman. Never, never let her go. And then, while they clung to one another on the Liverbrook, their backs to the weather, he said, You sang to me once in my desolation. Do you remember?" "I remember," she said. "Do you think you could sing to me again?" That night, Compline was a tender shock for all the animals. It woke them gently, then composed them for a yet more blessed sleep. It was sung in a woman's voice. Pertolote did not crow or cry out or lift up her voice in the treetops. It was crystal, ringing clearly of its own accord, completely clean. Her soul was a crystal bell. "For safety I commend my friends, their spirits, sleep, and all their ends, to God, and him whose life myself I live, his name, sweet singer, most I give, to God." Chanticleer inclined his ear and swallowed. It was an exquisite benediction to hear his name within her prayer, as though he were eavesdropping upon her love for him. When the singing had died from the sky, it continued to wring his heart. He did not sleep that night. He did not dream. Chapter 30. John Wesley. One of the reasons why John Wesley Weasel grew so long and narrow was to keep him from getting stuck. Maybe the Creator expected that weasel brains would figure they could go anywhere, and that weasel kidneys would know no caution, so that a bugger like John Wesley, charging straight forward with purblind courage, might find himself in straits, as it were, and stuck. Halfway down a burrow, and so forth, midway through two rocks. So what the Creator did, he gave John Wesley a skull bone bigger than any other part of his body. He shortened the legs and lengthened the tail, and he loosed this oddment to weasel devices, hoping, since no one else could restrain him, that his own head would. Well, if the head bone didn't fit, he'd be stopped right there at the beginning before matters got worse, right? And if John Wesley could get his head through anything first, why then the rest of him would follow like hoopla and happiness, right? To gauge him against his own fine qualities of daring, courage, pluck, and fearlessness, God gave John Wesley Weasel a fat head. And it worked reasonably well in the physical world. It failed in the spiritual. More times than a weasel liked to remember, he'd gotten himself stuck in tight situations. And sometimes he could brazen his way out. But sometimes he was plain stuck and discomfited. Once his head did not prohibit him from loving a mouse. A fool thing to do, to love a woman of any stripe, but a mouse? And then he'd acted moony, lounging at her door, puffing his chest, suffering the irritations of her 7 children, suffering them in silence, mind you, sparking, as he called it, sparking the widow. This was the situation. A pleasant one, he admitted at first, and worth the bother, because the widow had a touch of ferrety spunk herself. Oh, yes, she'd brought her children a monstrous piece from the mountain region downriver to Chanticleer's coop, and that by herself. And a weasel could admire weasel notions, even in a mouse, and in a woman. So John Wesley slipped into a situation. Pleasant at first. Then came the sticking. The wee widow mouse was murdered by a sliding basilisk, and John was the first to find her dead. And all at once he was stuck, squeezed in his grief. Nobody told John about grief. No, he couldn't scream the aching out of him. It stays. No, he couldn't fight nor murder nor slaughter the aching out of him, and though he scorched the battlefield that day, and though he killed a countless host himself, inspiring the animals unto victory, he lay down that night still aching. Nor was it the loss of his ear that caused this aching. It was the wee widow mouse, dead, and the aching didn't pass. See? No way out of that situation except maybe time. Time, busyness, action, no thinkings, since thinks buggers the brain. Noise. But even in these latter days, John Wesley will notice one of the brothers' mice in a certain pose, Freytag laughing, Samstag crying, and suddenly he'll feel the pressure of his grief for the widow, stuck, still stuck, even though God gave him this fat head. And now, in the northern regions of the world, it had happened again, and the world was in a bad way. Old and gloomy memories were troubling him, and he moved with a slow step among the pine, frowning. It was an article of faith with him that thinking's buggers the brains, yet here he was, thinking. He tried a few short punches to cleanse himself, rising on his haunches. Do and do for you! It didn't work. Do what, and for who? Despite his head, John Wesley had sort of got himself stuck again, this time in a totally unexpected pinch, but one of his own making nonetheless. He had discovered lonesomeness. Worse, he felt it, and this gave him pause. It made him think, as it were, because this was no mere want for company. John Wesley had felt a cold and total solitude, and in that moment he believed in endings. Endings. Only so many critters in this universe, and few at that. Endings. One by one the critters die. Endings. But could be all die together, and then there would be a universe turning silently, but no critters. Hoopla! Shouted John Wesley in a pine forest, as loud as he could, to shake these gloominesses. Hoopla! Hoopla! Hoop! Well, what had happened was John Wesley had sort of come to an end, bumped into one. Not only in his vigor had he cleared the territories of their populations, leaving himself to scramble alone while others went south for dinner. Not only was he truly tired from the labors, and maybe that made even a weasel vulnerable to contemplations and philosophies, seeing how seldom a weasel is weary unto idleness, but also John Wesley had traveled, finally, to the northernmost regions of the continent. He had walked out into the utter wastes of the tundra, when all the stars were a shower in black heaven, and all the white around him cold and ghostly. He had seen his own paw dark upon the ancient glacier. He had heard and felt the polar wind. And nothing in this vast, impassive realm either cared or knew that a weasel was there. It dawned on John Wesley like thought. Nothing could care, because nothing here was alive, except for himself. He had come to an end. He stood in it. Ice below, ice pieces suspended for stars above, and only the emptiness between. John Wesley shriveled. He had another thought, that his own little life could wink out, and then the world would be deserted, left to the wind and stone and ice alone. Hey ho, try me yo, weasels, sucker buggers, oh, gives to butts 100 cuts and says, please pass the sugar, oh. Thus he recited now in the pine forest, stomping his hind paws, beating his fore ones together, raising up his fat head. Hey ho, bite me yo, weasels whirling fast and slow, whips you raw, jaw, paw, and claw, then sits to see how fast you go. No good. Taunt songs, bawdy songs, and he was stuck. He sat down. Well, John had escaped the tundra as soon as he felt its haunting on his spirit. He had run to the green, south to the forests and some thin light again. But even so, he ran slower than usual, and memories began to bear him down. And the death of the widow, which he hadn't openly considered for so long, saddened him. And it was strange, but the old ache was in him again, almost as though grieving and the northern cold were one and the same. He thought he saw what the widow might have seen in the instant before she died, and he thought, oh, widow, how lonely! And he thought, why come someone's couldn't be with you then? Okay, roared John Wesley Weasel in the middle of a pine forest. He leaped up and raced on short legs in a hard, tight circle. Do and do and do for you, John W.! And he bellowed at the top of his lungs, thinking's buggers the brains! He stopped and thrust his paw high in the air, declaring, time's for John to go home now! He sat down, frowning. Stuck. Who knows how long a weasel, on first descending into melancholy, stays there? No one, not even John. One thing for sure, He wouldn't blame his rooster anymore for gloominesses, since he found out what powerful things they were, even to overcome a W. John Wesley thought that thought most solemnly, but then it became the last thought of his gloom, and suddenly he was delivered. He heard a living voice. "Do and do for you! Double do!" His hair stood up. A piece of rust went flying over his head. John Wesley sprang for the hollows beneath the pine and crouched, 3/4 hidden. But there was no one in the forest. Dead logs, ice-locked, rocks outcropping. No one. He stretched his neck. Suddenly behind him the voice announced its position, yelling, "Hoopla!" He snapped round but saw nothing. Then closer from the tree at his left, the voice sang, "Gives someone what for? Hoopla! Hoopla!" John twisted into knots. By God, the devil was quick! 3 cries from 3 places and never a dash between. John's heart had begun to pump. A little fear, a little admiration, a great huge rush of excitement. War! Well, and if this was war, then let the warriors emerge. What kind of a bloody warrior hides? Not John W., whether he knows the foe or not. By God! His head low down, his lip curled back from a row of needle teeth, John Wesley Weasel stepped to open ground. Flashing his eye all round himself, he drew his legs together, humping and hardening his spine, tightening like a bowstring. His claw closed on the earth. He found a footing. At the bare glimpse of a throat, this weasel could spring and slash it. He was a deadly weapon, and he knew it. Slow, slow, he delivered the challenge in a hiss. "Show! Someone's show him damn self to me!" But "Show!" sang the voice from the left-hand tree, and then quick as sin it shifted and sang from the right, "Damn self, hee-hee!" Hee-hee! What it was, there were 3 enemies, and John was surrounded, and it was their territory, not his, and they knew the terrain. He didn't, so every advantage was theirs. Hot damn, John liked them odds. Black thunder was his face. He was feeling better. "This W," he hissed. "He fights like a fighter. Teeth to tooth, in the open. Come out, someone's. Kill or bloody be killed by John. Hee-hee." Hee-hee, for God's sake, who giggles at battles? At threats? At John? John threw himself into his viciousness. He extended his long body and roared, "See me? See John? John's built to go into hiding places, bugger! Fang first and death in his mouth." He began to crawl toward the left-hand tree. Target, hee-hee! Oh, those giggles were intolerable. Oh, this weasel trembled, the bolt so close to shooting. "No protections, no, you don't come to John, so John, he comes to you." John coiled, but in the instant before his launch, he heard the wail, "No, not them! A new critter come? Me, kill me!" John spun on his tail and saw a full-grown coyote limping toward him from the east, unguarded, unable, desperately abject. By her hind legs alone, she was pushing herself ahead, her cheek and chest both on the ground. What? Cripples came to fight him? He turned toward his target again and found his anger somewhat off rhythm. He hesitated. "Please," the woman whined, "they could outrun you, and even if you eat them, they're a mouthful apiece. I'm dinner for several days." What kind of a war was this? Hee-hee! That giggle again. Hee-hee-hee-hee! From points north, west, and south of the weasel. John was growing bewildered by this sort of aggression. Might be a truce and some talking together? All at once the gigglers appeared and began to charge at him, and John Wesley was thunderstruck. "Babies!" he murmured, fluffy, rusty, delighted with the scene they had caused. John was going to slaughter baby coyotes? Gah! The closer they came, the more the woman panicked. "Here! Fight me! Fight me!" So she was the mama, but he was fighter no more. He turned to her for help. He took a step and said, "Mama Coyote, But then he got another shock. Straight away the woman leaped a full 9 feet through the air, a strong, spectacular flight away from him, astonishing grace. Nevertheless, when she hit ground again, she twisted into crippledness and crawled all broken back to him, and poor John, his wits were gone. No, he wasn't gloomy any more, just confused and tired, and might be he should be alone. Mama Coyote, she doesn't need to worry, no, he said delicately. John goes away now, okay? Goodbye, goodbye. But he had forgotten the baby attack on its way. The brother of the bunch, utterly fearless, tumbled forward, knocked a weasel, and stuck his nose into John Wesley's mouth, crying, Hello? Hello? Benoni, no! The woman rushed between them on healthy legs. Right, no, gagged the weasel, spitting fur. Why couldn't you stay at the den? She cuffed a sister. Right, at the den! The weasel approved of the discipline. I can't, while she cuffed the other, watch and forage both. Right, roared the weasel, can't. Goodbye, but do and do and do, sang this little Benoni, happily plucking weasel whiskers one at a time. Ack, get, bellowed the weasels, snatching back his whiskers. John needs them things. And get, he howled at the sister, who was sniffing his behind, the most indefensible part of his anatomy. Get, he pleaded with the sister, who was licking all his old scars with maternal compassion. Mama Coyote, doesn't you see to your children's? But Mama Coyote was no help at all. She had changed again. She was plain sitting on her haunches, her muzzle stretched up to heaven, her eyes shut tight and running tears, and she was laughing. John, under full attack, was on his own. Doesn't, he roared, Mama Coyotes spank them bratlings? She shook her head. She couldn't speak for laughing. Doesn't Mama Coyotes worries that bloody warriors swallows children down? Then language burst from the woman. Soldiers, she gasped, who stomp and sweat in your own backyard look ridiculous. John Wesley Weasel, bloody warrior, locked in battle with babies, suddenly saw himself, stomping and sweating, glowering, threatening, glooming about such things as end of the world, solemn about lonesomeness and death. John Wesley Weasel suddenly saw himself ridiculous, so he said, Ha! Loud as a horn, and that's how he laughed. Ha ha! Roared John Wesley on account of his silliness, and ha! Because by gaw, here these babies liked him, and he liked to be liked. For the space of a day, by the grace of God, the weasel forgot hunger, the winter, the world, and all. He had a vacation. What's a double do? Asked Benoni. Fearsomeness, threats, and storms spits, growled the weasel. What gobbles children? Ha! Cried Benoni, Marshmallow Coyote. Double do knows about the witch with no stomach? Ha! Cried John Wesley. Is my mama? Benoni laughed. Private stories shared make friends. Double do, you only got one ear. John's mama freezed one off for sassings. Double do you got courage? Courage is braveness. John got braveness, you bet. Beats little buggers' heads in. Benoni presented his head to find out what beatings in were like. Rips out little buggers' gizzards. Twill searched her whole body for a gizzard which could be ripped out. Bites tails to make some garter straps. Immediately 3 tails were in his mouth. Ack! Oh, what a pleasure on a very cold day. And Mama watched, grinning. And Mama it was who invited a tired warrior to rest in their den at the end of it. And a warrior was glad again. So easily John Wesley's head fit through the hole into their den, and so domestic was the den itself, like a little hut against the weather. Where babies are, where women sit, the fighter can't be brutal any more. John lay relaxed, while Benoni Coyote gazed at him with unabashed interest. So, said the weasel. Benoni nodded solemnly. So was a fine thing to say and hear. So, might be, the weasel began, little Benoni, He doesn't know from what is a bloody warrior. Warrior, said Benoni, nodding, a manly conversation. Is mighty, is a warrior, fights fights of goodness and nobleness. My papa is mighty, Benoni declared. Benoni got a papa? John Wesley scrutinized the pup. He thought backward a minute. Is skinny? He asked. Benoni nodded. Sometimes stiff as wood. A wooden critter? Benoni nodded. Well, John thinks he meets Benoni's papa once. Then you're lucky, aren't you, Double Do, said Benoni, 'cause he's stronger than bears and faster than hawks, and he could beat the witch with no stomach. Mighty. Okay, John thought it wise to say, mighty Coyote. There was a nice silence in the den. Rachel combed her daughter's coats with a motherly claw. Benoni sat fixed, staring at the weasel. Double Do? He whispered. He had a new question in his head. What, little Benoni Coyote? A very important question, for the pup squirmed round until he put his nose to the weasel's nose, and he took John Wesley's face between his paws. Very earnestly he said, You're my friend now, right? Ack, said John. He began to clear his throat. That was his answer. And do you love somebody with a very big, big love? The weasel thought of a rooster, his melancholy lord, but he said, Don't squash John's face, okay? No kissings. Warriors hate kissings, okay? But Benoni had another matter on his mind, so deep and serious that it made his eyes seem old indeed. Please, he said, when you go, if you meet my papa again, please tell him to hurry home. Tell him Benoni loves him with a very big, big love. Double Do, tell him that Benoni misses him.